So I'm delighted now to welcome the panel for the first section. This is a scene setter. It's a kind of soup to nuts of science, policy, research, and action. And we're really honored to have three people who can fill that whole waterfront. So Professor Corinne Quere is FRS and Professor of Climate Change Science at the University of East Anglia. Professor Julian Allwood is Professor of Engineering and the Environment at the University of Cambridge. It's actually really difficult to imagine a title with that second half added in Cambridge until very recently. So signals of progress, even in 800-year-old institutions. Dr. Alina Averchenkova is Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science, but also brings with her a depth of knowledge, experience, direct professional experience in the UN system. So a great panel. Please, first of all, come to the stage, Corinne, who's going to give us a bit of a scene setter for 15 minutes. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here to share some thoughts about climate change, about my experience. And I want to dive in straight with a little bit of science at the start, just to make sure that we're, in fact, all on the same page. So this is the global mean temperature change that is observed at the surface from instrumental data starting in 1850, so that's 170 years ago almost, up to, well, the last full year, 2018. You see one data point every year, and you do see a 1 degree warming over the whole record of time temperature. And I want to just explain two things here. First, on the left-hand side, the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. How do we know the temperature is warming? And I'm going to provide 4 explanations on the left-hand side and 4 explanations on the right-hand side. So how do we know, or how is the observations of the Earth warming? Well, one thing is that it's warming almost everywhere. It's warming over the continents more than over the ocean, which is expected because the ocean, the temperature is absorbed downwards. There's also warming-related variables, for example, sea level rise. So that's because we're warming the ocean, hot water expands a little, and the only place that the ocean can expand is upwards. So you see very well the rise in sea level over the entire ocean that is consistent with this. We also see snow and ice melting for a very obvious reason. And here is the Arctic minimum ice zone, which has completely shrunk by 40% in just a few decades. And the last piece of information, are there scientists in the room here? There must be. Really? Shy scientist. Well, the last bit of information is the one that I'm most excited about. It's a little bit complicated, but this is what it looks like. And the reason why it's so complicated, it's so exciting, is because what I'm showing here is, in fact, the salinity of the ocean. So you have the colors here are the salinity of the ocean. It's particularly saline in the Atlantic, particularly fresh in the Pacific. But you have the contours on top of this, and the contours are the trends in the salinity of the ocean. And it just so happens that the trends in the salinity of the ocean are exactly matching the patterns of salinity in the ocean. And what that means is that the water cycle is in fact accelerating. And this is an evidence also of the planet warming. On the right-hand side, warming of the climate system from human activity is unequivocal. How on earth do we know that we're causing this warming? Well, the very first bit of information is that we understand the process. This is not a new science. Greenhouse gas absorb radiation, and they trap the radiation in the atmosphere. We've known this for over since 1850. And this is actually just very well understood climate science. The other one is that the rate of warming is faster than we can observe in the past at least 1,000 years, and this piece of evidence is getting stronger through time. The third one is the strongest of the evidence, and that is because you cannot explain the warming, which is the black line here, unless you include greenhouse gases. So this is with greenhouse gases. This is without greenhouse gases. So what you have in this packet here is an average of models, the best models around the world that you actually reproduce. You use the models to test your hypothesis, to reproduce the reality. It combines the observations on the left-hand side and the physical understanding on the right-hand side. And the very last bit of information, why we know that it's humans, and that's actually my favorite, and it's because there is no alternative explanation. I mean, this is science. We have a set of observations. We have a plausible, tested hypothesis of human-driven climate change, and there is absolutely nothing else that can explain it. This is not natural variability, although obviously there is natural variability here, but natural variability doesn't explain this rise up there. And how do we know this? Oh, before I tell you how we know this, I want to also set something straight here. I mean, in this room tonight, there is probably a degree warming. There's a degree warming between where I stand here and where you are in the back, so what's the big deal? Well, that's because we're talking about internal temperature. So I am the Earth here with 14 degrees warming. There are different organisms which are perfectly healthy. The orangutan, for example, is perfectly healthy at 33 degrees Celsius of corporal temperature, and birds are perfectly healthy at a lot warmer temperature. But of course, if I have a fever, then I don't know about you, but I complain a lot when I have a fever. Sweats, discomfort, shivers, headaches. The hotter, the higher the fever, the more discomfort I have. And if you have a fever and somebody upsets you, then you really can't take it. If a bug comes, then you can easily get a pneumonia. You're less resilient. It's the same for the Earth. The Earth has this equilibrium. It's an internal temperature. You regulate. The Earth is regulated through a water cycle. The biosphere is where it is because there's been an evolution, a geological evolution, and the same with the human society and infrastructure. We have developed ourselves in this temperature, and changing the temperature actually makes a big deal of a difference. And we know this. Why do we know this? Is because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up quite a while ago now, 40 years ago almost, to assess the scientific, technical evidence on climate change and make an assessment of where we are with the human attribution of climate change. And there's quite a lot of reports, as you can see. And this is me here at the policy approval of the very last report of the IPCC. This is really 4 a.m., so we were still working at 4 a.m. on the last day trying to get the IPCC approved. We ran out of biscuits at 11 p.m. and out of water at 1 p.m., but we managed to actually close the report at about 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning, so we could then afterwards publish it. The IPCC has actually earned a Nobel Peace Prize for its work in 2007. It's around, I've worked in all these 3 reports here, and it's around the time of the middle report where my colleagues and I in science said, look, you know, these IPCC reports, they're repeated only every 5-6 years, and although no other science is scrutinized as much as climate change science, in fact, we thought that doing this every 5-6 years was not enough. The policymakers meet every year, twice a year even. They're meeting next week. This is what we're here to talk about. And therefore, it would be better to start publishing every year an update of the carbon cycle, which is my area of research. So we started to publish something called the Global Carbon Budget. And the Global Carbon Budget says, well, how much emissions, if given a temperature target, how much emissions do we have, what do we need to do with the emissions for the temperature to stabilize to a target that you're given from a policy experience? And in fact, from science, if you want the temperature to stop rising, so if you want to stop this upwards rise, then it turns out you have to bring your emissions of CO2, which is a long-lived greenhouse gas, down to net zero, which means zero overall. So if you have emissions that are up because you haven't succeeded to bring them to zero, then you need to have carbon sinks, for example, plant a forest, to offset your emissions that are out. And this is whatever the degree warming you're prepared to happen, your emissions have to, if you want to stabilize your warming, your emissions have to go down to zero. So we started to actually say this. So we repeated this on and on and on at the Conference of the Parties, which is the UN body that regulates international agreement on climate change. And this is me here. In this is 2015 here. So the making of the Paris Agreement happened, in fact, there was an attempt before Paris, you might remember, in Copenhagen in 2009, and it didn't work out, and then eventually 2015 worked out. The Paris Climate Agreement is it's a masterpiece of diplomacy. I mean, I am so impressed with diplomats like we have one here in the room tonight. The lady who will come in the panel, the diplomats that did this agreement are so clever because they have put two things in the agreement. One, they have put a temperature limit, which is based on science. So the Paris Agreement aims to limit warming well below 2 degrees, which is based on science. I could give you a full lecture on this, I won't, and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But it also invites country to say, please country, would you say what your contribution is to the Paris Agreement? And so countries have come forward to not only say what their contributions would be, but to explain and rationalize why this is a reasonable contribution for that specific country. And so countries have to come to the table. Of course, when you do this, then you add up the contribution, and they don't add up to your objective here of your warming limit, and therefore, this is where the cleverness comes from, and therefore there's a mechanism in the Paris Agreement to bring back new, stronger contributions, so countries are invited to come up with stronger contributions every 5 years. I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. But the Paris Agreement also includes this statement here to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emission by sources and removal by sinks. And the reason I was particularly happy with this sentence is that it sounds like it's coming straight out of a scientific paper. Mine, maybe. Wishful thinking. The making of the future we want has started. Have you noticed that the last year has been a bit special in terms of climate change? There has been things, I've worked on climate change probably about 25 years now, and for 24 years I had the impression that it was just a one-way process. So I was saying things like in the ether, and sometimes things happen very rarely. And in the last year, there was quite a lot of things have happened with this incredible person here, starting with that. The Fridays Fridays for Future school strikes. Then there's Extinction Rebellion, who have also made a lot of activity. And quite a lot of famous people have urged for action as well. I'm talking about the prince here, obviously, not me. It's been very special, it's been very encouraging. It's also moved quite a lot of policymakers in this country and elsewhere to step up action in their country. And I had an interesting phone call, in fact, almost a year ago, just like, almost exactly a year ago, from the French president. And I can't resist to show you this picture because after my wedding picture, this is the best picture of me. Although I was a lot more smiley on my wedding day. So I had a phone call from the office of the French president to ask if I would chair their Haut Conseil pour le Climat, which is an independent scientific and technical body that aims to evaluate the strategy of the French government in terms of climate action. And there is, in the UK, a committee on climate change that has been set up in 2008, so has 11 years now of existence, that has advised the UK government on climate change quite successfully, I think. And with the result that the UK emissions have decreased more than 40%. You can discuss a lot about the details of this, but there has been real action in this country. So France has, in part inspired by this, set up this committee there. But the beauty about the French action is that in this picture, you don't see the Minister for Environment. Well, in fact, you see him, but as you can see, he's actually struggling a little bit to be in the picture. What you do see is control at the top, is the president, is the prime minister, is the minister of the economy, is the minister for public action, whatever that means, who are there to steer action on climate change. It is now the time that action on protecting the environment and on tackling climate change gets out of the Ministry for the Environment and into mainstream politics. This is what we need, because we need action to be coherent across the board for everything. So I'm just going to do a couple more slides and close. This is really important that this transition to net zero carbon is managed in a way that is fair, that is efficient, that is rapid, that is coherent, because not only we have seen incredible positive things on the left-hand side, we've also seen that responses are not going to be easy. We've seen protests in France and Ecuador, in the Netherlands. We've seen things that are very disturbing in the London subway in response to the Extinction Rebellion disruption of the London subway. So this transition is going to require a lot of work. The work has started. It's not going to be easy, and it needs to be well informed. Thank you.
Do take a seat. If I go at this end, then I can see you also. There you go. Thank you. So, while formally and technically I'm chairing this, actually there's going to be team chairing. I'm going to encourage each of you to throw questions at each other and build off comments and questions you hear. But at the same time, we're not going to have 45 minutes of listening followed by we'll see, it's up to you. Actually, we'll get to the we'll see, it's up to you much earlier. So we might have a bit of a conversation rolling and turn to our friends in the audience. One challenge I've given all of our panelists is to prepare a question and an answer for themselves. What is the question that you always want to be asked on these panels and never get asked? On another day, I'll tell you mine. But what I want to do first, Alina, is invite you to unpack a bit the process we're in the midst of. I mean, COP25, there's a sort of mystery buried there, some initials followed by a number. Take us a little way into the background.
Sure, I think Corinne has given, good evening, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. It's great to be with you today. I think Corinne has provided us an excellent background, and I think one asks, COP in Paris in 2015, that was a great summit which delivered on an international agreement. Last year's COP, Conference of the Parties, was COP24, and the significance of that meeting was that it delivered on the rule book on how to implement the political agreement which was reached in Paris. Next year is COP26, which will be here in the UK, in Glasgow, is a very important one where countries are expected to come with new pledges under the Paris Agreement. So what is this COP this year? Does it even matter? Why does it matter? And the Chilean presidency, Chile is actually presiding over the COP, even though it's taking place in Madrid. They called it an ambition COP because they see it as a stepping stone of getting to Glasgow next year. So they want to push countries to come forward with new pledges. So far, there are about 68 or 69 countries which signaled that they might increase ambition. So I think the Chilean presidency, the Minister of Environment, Carolina Schmidt, and her team, they're very keen to see some of these pledges become more concrete. And what they're also trying to do, and that's a great picture about the French approach there, they're bringing to the conversation in Madrid not just environmental ministers, but also ministers of energy, ministers of finance, and they're all going to sit together and discuss how to make this low carbon and climate resilient transition happen. And I can talk more about various details of that, but I think this is, in terms of the big picture, that's where we are this year.
Thank you. Do you want to add any more about what you anticipate from the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I think this, to me, I see the COP next week as the last, sort of the last chapter of part one of the Paris Agreement. So indeed, next year is where the big things are going to happen with the countries coming back and strengthening their commitments. But this year is really about closing and tightening the rule book, is about making sure that countries have understood what their role and expectations are going to be. It's about discussions, early discussions about financing. It's about creating alliances so that next year they're going to link with each other and say, well, I'll do this if you do that. This is how it works. So it's about really closing. It's about testing that the Paris Agreement is going to work. I mean, this is the chance to say, well, this is a rock-solid agreement, and next year, well, countries will come and step up.
And in relation to the evolution of the science with the policy over time, you know, there has been a sense in the past that, you know, science has delivered the results, now policy should act. You described a slightly more interactive relationship, particularly in the context of net zero ambitions.
Absolutely.
Could you expand a bit on what that might mean? And Julian might touch a little on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I did think somewhere around 2015 that I had done my job and I could actually do something else and leave it on to the policymakers to do things. And then I sort of realized two things. One is that the scientists, we have process. I mean, even when I started to do policymaking, I mean, I was really out of my comfort zone big ways. I was really scared, but it's about process. I mean, we're scientists. We know we can add numbers. We can say, well, you know, are your assumptions solid? Do the numbers match? Have you verified and all this? So this is a process. And if you sit by a policymaker or a group of people taking decision, just being asking the question is actually super useful. And the other thing that I realized is, in fact, scientists were quite trusted in society in a way that policymakers would never dream of. And so it's very useful to be there and to continue to support the process because somehow we're trusted because essentially we just say it the way it is, usually. Well, mostly.
Thank you. Yes. So, Julian, you're going to have an opportunity a little later to really fill out the new net zero report that you and your colleagues have put together. But this is an opportunity to do a sort of cinema trailer of what is in the report and to pick up this question about how the science-policy relationship is evolving and the significance that has in the area that you're working.
Yeah, thank you. The preparation you gave me 2 minutes before we started was to think of the question that I'd like to be asked. So the question that nobody's ever asked me is, have you ever written an album of pop songs about a low-carbon industrial future? And I think that's an important question because what Corinne has talked about is the science policy interface, but actually the solution space, what we do about mitigation, is characterized usually as being at the interface of engineering and economics. So those two subjects are currently very, very far apart from each other. They don't talk easily. In engineering, we have, I think, a real problem in teaching our students whether a bridge will stay up. And we give them a lot of exercises to practice coming up with an analytical answer to that question. But we never give them any training in the question, who will pay for the bridge? Whereas in economics, then it's assumed that almost everything is fungible and is up for argument, and therefore that physical evidence is rather unconstrained. So the word technology, which both subjects share, has such a different meaning, it's actually very difficult to have an intelligent conversation with each other. So I think what to me is the biggest gap, and which I think will become apparent in the COP discussions next week, is about what we think technology is likely to achieve over the next 30 years. And it comes about this problem of disciplines, that the people who've trained in the arts have a sort of slightly romantic view that technology can do anything. You just have to ask it to do it. Where from the engineering point of view, we have a slightly more nuanced view that technology actually has some limits, but we're, by tradition, not very good at trying to work out what the journey is to get from the invention in the lab to big-scale deployment. So I think what's missing is people who have an engineering training or an economics training and who can really do dialogue between those two areas. So the thing that's missing is the bridge between CP Snow's two cultures. They remain far apart at the moment. Our government is populated by almost everybody having done a degree called PPE from someplace just the other side of Reading. Can't remember where it is. And that's great. They're very good at arguing, but they've never encountered physical evidence. It never comes up. So it's apparently unconstrained. Technology is something that you can just invest in and have anything you like back. So I think more of us should be trying to find a way across that quite big chasm. And it's a long journey. With economics, it takes months and days and hours and years of effort, repeated effort of trying to learn how to understand each other. So as a first step, as an engineer, writing an album of pop songs about a low-carbon industrial future is a symbol of trying to break out of our little silo, the labels, that allowing other people to label you. And sales, I have to say, have been slow to build. But if you're looking for a novelty Christmas present that nobody will anticipate, there are a lot of love analogies in the way that we choose to recycle steel that deserve more exploration.
I can confirm that it is the perfect Christmas gift. Yes, so A.D. Grummett is certainly that's correct.
Yeah.
So we'll do, and maybe try and get another plug in later. Aline.
Comments on that as well.
Sorry?
Could I jump in here
Yes,
as well?
yes, please, I wanted you to.
We mentioned science, we mentioned policy and technology, and the other element which we haven't touched upon yet is finance, which is the other piece of the puzzle that will be discussed in Madrid at the COP. And obviously, in order to make sure that technology, low-carbon technology is adopted, in particular in developing countries, they need significant assistance. Also to adapt to impacts of climate change. So one of the issues for this COP will be how much progress have we made in terms of providing finance to support, in particular, developing countries and highly vulnerable countries in their effort to reduce emissions and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So you might know that right around Copenhagen summit, even a few years before Paris, a pledge has been made by developed countries, industrialized countries, to mobilize up to $100 billion annually, coming from various public and private sources to support developing countries in that transition. And so at this meeting, so by 2020, next year, we should really hit that target, but we're not quite there yet. There is a recent analysis by OECD, which shows that there is still a gap, and that will be discussed as well at this conference of the parties. And what do we need to do going forward to scale up mobilization of financial resources and potentially to go beyond that and actually move to greening the whole financial system. So as some experts refer to moving trillions rather than billions that will be needed to finance transition.
A question to any of you, but you might start with you, is do we have any signals that sort of indicate a species from the financial sector that tell us that this is something that could move quickly? Have we got any examples that show that if they really woke up, then they could accelerate the pace of transition?
So I think that's the really important thing that Alina's just talked about is the difference between developed economies and developing economies. And clearly there is a need to support with financing developing economies. In developed economies, it isn't clear to me that investment is really the problem, because that assumes that the solution is new assets that are going to be purchased and installed. But actually the really big issue, and the reason I think this dialogue between technology and economics is so important, is that the way we use energy is the problem much more than the way that we generate it. In every developed country in the world apart from America, cars are still getting heavier year on year. And the only reason they're getting lighter in America is that they were twice as big in the first place. So when I was a student, I had a car that weighed 700 kilograms, and the average car now sold in the UK weighs 1,450 kilograms. So that means that when you drive, and on average you drive with 1.6 people in the car, then the car weighs 12 times more than the mass of the passengers. Now, I don't think you have to be a genius. You certainly don't have to be an engineer or a scientist, and maybe even economists can understand that difficult point. We could drive smaller cars. So if that's part of the solution space, it isn't obvious that investment is the problem. So there's a whole set of different mechanisms about using technology differently, which don't depend on investment, and therefore which do require a different set of motivating mechanisms.
So economists have taken a bit of a hit. I'll buy any of you a drink if you're in the audience at the break time. But I don't agree with economists on lots of things, but actually one of the things I remain utterly baffled by is the failure for carbon taxation or pricing to have a more prominent presence in this debate across the last quarter century. One of your slides referenced this directly and in the negative, as in the French tried to move forward with this and were forced back. Corinne, do you want to just expand on that case?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, all economists say it. The carbon tax is the cheapest way for the economy as a whole to achieve a move out of carbon emissions. But the problem is that when you put a carbon tax, it's regressive. So the poor people pay more relative to their salary than the rich people would pay. And if you put a just very high tax like the French have done and crank it up very quickly, then this effect actually becomes very obvious and apparent to people who have not necessarily got the money to switch over, and also when there is no opportunities to do the switch. So if you're pressurized with something that is expensive, you have to have a pathway out of this. And the French have done the carbon tax according to what was needed to move out of the fossil fuel, but all the other sort of mechanics of this was perhaps not as much in place as it could have been. And we have, in my advisory board, we have advised to actually make the carbon tax evolve. But one thing that is very interesting that emerged from this sort of experience, and it is an experience, and we're going to have lots of experience. Some will succeed, others will fail, others will have to move on. But the thing that emerged from this is that the feeling of unfairness is very, very big and important and not to be neglected. The people who were hit by the carbon tax said, why me? Why do I have to pay? And the rich guys who take the plane have to pay less than me, or the taxis have exemptions, or the heavyweights, or the airports, and everybody then all of a sudden start to look at each other and say, are they paying? Are they doing something? It should be the rich. It should be the Chinese. It should be blah, blah, blah. And then it's just endless. And so to have a fair transition to a carbon neutrality, to net zero economy is just so incredibly important, because it's not going to work. It's not going to work on so many levels if it's not fair and perceived to be fair, and also realistically fair. I mean, society is not fair already, but at least it should be perceived that everybody has a role to play, plays their role, and the role is commensurate with what they can deliver.
Good news coming out of politics in the Northern Hemisphere in the last few years has been pretty rare, but I did have a real moment of punching the air when a Republican candidate at the time that Mr. Trump was elected shaped a phrase around carbon taxation that just really felt like this is something that could survive 4 election cycles, something that could work across the whole piece. And I mean, I think taxes are a bit like comedy. They're very culturally specific. But in this case, here was something we could all work with. And the phrase in that case was, he promoted the idea of carbon-funded tax reduction. Now, actually, he was talking about a carbon tax, but he was saying, we'll give it you back in entrepreneurship or in reductions in income tax. that was a hopeful moment. I haven't had so many. So, yes, go on quickly, yeah.
So
And then
there
we'll
is
go to
another
questions from
issue
you.
about the carbon tax, which is that it has to be global, because otherwise the industry in one area is immediately penalized relative to the neighboring ones. And to make that work, you need a global police force. And we don't have a global police force. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is an opt-in voluntary organization. So it isn't actually clear to me that it's the right mechanism to think of. It's a nice economically theoretical ideal, but in practice, we haven't got one. And it's not actually how we've dealt with other problems of this type, especially now we've got a zero emissions target. So asbestos, I think, is a very interesting parallel, where now any government that said, I just feel it's a bit too much of a restraint on business, we should allow everybody to use asbestos, would be voted out immediately. We've all accepted that asbestos is a public health hazard. So that would be a different way of thinking about regulation or government action on climate change, is to think of it as a problem for public health. The challenge to that, of course, is that the first death from asbestos was in 1923, and global production peaked in 1970. So it took nearly 50 years to get it there, but we have now got to the point that it's unthinkable that we would take it away. So I wonder if we actually just have to say, carbon taxing, we're not going to get there. We've been trying that for 20 or 30 years. Let's look for other mechanisms.